The first thing Private Daniel Carr remembered was the taste of dust. It clung to his tongue, gritty and metallic, mixing with the copper bite of blood at the corner of his mouth. The world around him pulsed like a heartbeat. Dark light, as his vision struggled to return from the concussion's fog. Somewhere beyond the ringing in his ears, he heard shouting, then boots. Then the mechanical clink of a rifle bolt sliding into place. He wasn't dead. Not yet. Daniel pressed a hand against the ground, but the soil shifted beneath him. Loose sand crushed stalks, the debris of what had once been a field. A moment ago, it had been a battlefield, or maybe a blind corner on a patrol route. He couldn't even remember which came first, the explosion or the fall. His head throbbed, each pulse a shockwave. Then he heard the dogs. He tensed instinctively. Military dogs meant search teams, and search teams meant capture or worse. Daniel opened his eyes fully. A blur of uniforms moved through the dust silhouettes, cutting across the sun like jagged shadows. His heart hammered. Damn it, I'm caught. He had been separated from his unit after the ambush. They had trained for this possibility, rehearsed code words, memorized diagrams of resistance strategies, but now staring at the soldiers closing in around him, theory dissolved into something raw and paralyzing. A boot pressed to his back. The weight wasn't heavy, but the intent was clear: don't run. Not that he could. His legs felt like wet sandbags, numb and useless. A voice barked orders. The language wasn't English, but the tone didn't need translation. Impatience, aggression, the clipped sharpness of someone used to compliance. Daniel's hands trembled as they were yanked behind him and bound with coarse rope. Heat flooded his face. Humiliation, fear, disbelief, they all crashed together in a rising tide. He was a prisoner, a POW, and he knew what could happen to POWs. Stories circulated in barracks, the kind whispered only when lights were off. Some enemy units followed international rules. Others, not so much. Men went missing. Men came back broken. Men didn't come back at all. Daniel swallowed, but his mouth was too dry to fully complete the motion. He felt like something fragile inside him was cracking. They dragged him across the dirt, past burned-out jeeps, past the carcass of a supply truck, still smoldering from whatever had hit it. All the while he struggled to breathe in shallow, steady sips. Panic made his vision tunnel. Stay calm, soldier. You know the protocol. Name, rank, serial number. Nothing more. But fear has its own gravitational pull, and Daniel felt himself rotating helplessly around it. They pushed him into a transport truck. The door slammed behind him with the heavy finality of a coffin lid. The engine rumbled to life, vibrating through the metal floor. Daniel leaned against the wall, trying not to think about what awaited him at wherever they were taking him. An interrogation center, a black site camp, a makeshift holding cell in a bombed-out building. Time blurred inside the truck. Minutes could have been hours. Hours could have been minutes. The rumble of the road beneath him became hypnotic. Every curve felt like a countdown. Eventually, the truck slowed, then stopped. The doors swung open and Daniel squinted as sunlight stabbed his eyes. He was pulled down, roughly, his boots scraping against gravel. In front of him, rows of concrete structures stretched like a forgotten industrial compound. Dust swirled in the wind like ghostly fabric. The camp. He had imagined something worse: barbed wire spiraling like a serpent, towers bristling with guns, spotlights carving the earth. Instead, the place looked almost mundane. Squat buildings, a weathered gate, a few guards milling around with rifles slung lazily over their shoulders. But the plainness of it all felt even more sinister, like cruelty disguised as routine. A guard shoved him forward. Daniel stumbled but caught himself before falling. The guards exchanged a few bored-sounding remarks. He was just another captive to them, another file, another task. But inside Daniel, the world was far from routine. His mind raced ahead to the next steps: interrogation beatings, forced confessions. He had read the survival manuals. He had memorized the guidelines. He had been told that torture often started with psychological pressure before it escalated physically. When the guards pushed him into a shadowed room, everything in him braced. The air inside was stale, tinged with sweat and damp concrete. A single wooden chair sat in the middle of the room like a stage prop, waiting for a grim performance. A guard closed the door behind him. One remained. This guard was different. Smaller build, younger maybe, with dark eyes that flicked up and down Daniel's frame as if assessing the best place to strike. Daniel felt the instinctive urge to shrink, to protect vital organs, to brace for the first blow. His breathing quickened. The guard stepped closer. Daniel stiffened. This was it. He clenched his jaw, forced himself not to beg, not to plead, not to show fear, even as his body shook like a leaf in a storm. The guard stopped inches away. Daniel's pulse pounded in his throat. Then, a faint splash. He blinked, confused. The guard reached into a small canteen, lifted the cap, and gently, quietly held it out. Toward him. Water. Not a strike, not a threat. A gesture. Daniel stared, unable to process it at first. His body had been a coiled spring bracing for pain, and now it quivered in disbelief. The guard didn't speak. He simply extended the canteen a little closer, as if offering something fragile enough to shatter under tension. Daniel swallowed hard, the dryness in his throat suddenly unbearable. His hands were bound, so the guard lifted the canteen for him, tilting it gently. Cool water touched Daniel's lips, shockingly cool, indescribably real. A knot in his chest loosened as he drank slow at first, then with desperate gulps. The guard didn't stop him. For a moment the entire war went silent, just two humans in a concrete room, one terrified, one unexpected. Then the guard stepped back as if nothing had happened, snapped the cap shut, and walked to the door. No words, no explanation, no cruelty, only water, and a question that rooted itself deep inside Daniel. Why the door closed, leaving him alone with echoes of something that felt impossible in a place like this. Mercy. Real disarming mercy. Daniel sank to the floor, rope biting his wrists, water cooling the cracks in his fear. Something inside him shifted. Not hope, not yet, but the faintest suggestion that maybe everything he thought he understood about enemies wasn't the whole story. The moment was small. The moment was quiet. But it was the first moment since capture that didn't feel like the end. It felt like the beginning of something unexpected, something human. The guard returned the next morning. Daniel had barely slept, his body slumped against the cold concrete wall, wrists still bound, mind drifting in and out of shallow, fractured dreams where explosions blended with memories of home. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that canteen again, suspended in midair like an impossible miracle. He almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. Maybe it had been a hallucination from dehydration. Maybe the guard had been toying with him, offering hope, just to yank it away later. But when the metal door creaked open, reality stepped inside. The same guard, same uniform, same quiet eyes. He didn't bark orders, didn't shove Daniel like the others had. Instead, he glanced down at Daniel's wrists. The rope had rubbed the skin raw overnight. Streaks of dried blood darkened the fibers. The guard hesitated. Daniel noticed it, a flicker of uncertainty, as if the man were caught between duty and something deeper, older, harder to explain. Humanity wasn't a luxury soldiers could afford on either side of the war, yet something about this guard felt unarmored. Without a word, he knelt and loosened the rope. Daniel sucked in a sharp breath, not from pain, but from sheer disbelief. When the guard finished, he didn't remove the binds entirely. Protocol likely forbade it. But he loosened them enough so Daniel could flex his fingers, a gesture not of obligation, but of choice. The guard set down a bowl of thin porridge. Steam curled into the cold air like a fragile offering. Daniel stared. His stomach cramped at the smell. Warmth, salt, real food, but suspicion tightened his muscles. Is this a trick? A test. POWs were sometimes starved, then offered food to break their resolve. But the guard didn't seem to be studying him, didn't seem to relish power over him. He simply nudged the bowl closer. Daniel took a breath. "Why are you doing this?" he whispered, voice hoarse from thirst and fear. The guard didn't answer, not even with a glance. He just stood and left. Over the next several days, a strange pattern took root. Each morning the guard entered Daniel's cell. Sometimes he brought water, sometimes porridge, sometimes nothing at all, but he always loosened the ropes, always checked the bruises forming along Daniel's ribs from the rough transport, always moved with a kind of gentle efficiency, as though tending a wounded animal rather than overseeing a prisoner. Daniel learned the guard's footsteps, soft, steady, never rushed. He also learned something else. This guard rarely spoke to anyone, even his fellow soldiers. When other guards accompanied him, he stepped into the background, eyes lowered, voice unused. He wasn't timid, more like someone who had built an internal world and lived inside it. Quiet men, Daniel realized, were often the ones who thought the loudest. Sometimes, when the guard left the door open, a sliver longer than necessary, Daniel caught a glimpse of the camp. Rows of cells, a mess hall built from sandbags and scrap wood, a radio tower patched together with mismatched wires, smoke rising from a cooking fire that smelled faintly of lentils and cumin. Life went on here, mundane, monotonous, suffocating. War's greatest cruelty wasn't always death. Sometimes it was routine. On the fourth morning, Daniel decided to risk something. The guard placed a canteen in front of him. Daniel drank slowly. This time the edge of desperation softened by familiarity. When he finished, he wiped his lips with the back of his hand. "Thank you," he said softly. The guard's head snapped up, as if no prisoner had ever thanked him before. Daniel swallowed. "Do you have a name?" A pause. A long one. Then very quietly, as if revealing something dangerous, "Amir." Daniel repeated it in his mind. Amir. Not an enemy. Not a guard. A human. He wanted to ask more, where the man was from, whether he had a family, why he was helping a prisoner of war, but the words felt too heavy, too fragile. Amir stood there unreadable, then gave the faintest nod, almost a bow, before walking out. The door clicked shut, but the room felt different now, warmer somehow. Names have weight. Names turn shadows into people. The next day had a different rhythm. Instead of Amir, two unfamiliar guards stormed into the room. Their boots hit the floor with the aggressive confidence of men who enjoyed dominance. One yanked Daniel up by his collar, the other grinned as if anticipating entertainment. Daniel's blood went cold. The larger one shoved him into the chair at the center of the room, the same chair he'd noticed on the first day, the one he'd been terrified they'd drag him into. Today was the day. Interrogation. A small table stood nearby, scattered with items Daniel recognized from survival training. Blunt tools designed for psychological pressure, not outright cruelty, but pain came in many shapes. His heart thudded as the guards circled him. Then the door opened again. Amir stepped inside. His expression hardened at the sight of Daniel bound to the chair. He said something sharply in his language, short-clipped, urgent. The larger guard scoffed and waved him off. Amir moved closer. The two exchanged more words, their tones rising. Daniel didn't understand the language, but he understood rhythm. Amir argued with the contained energy of someone pleading logic. The others argued with the blunt edge of authority. Finally, the larger guard jabbed a finger into Amir's chest and barked a command. Amir froze. Daniel felt dread seeping into his bones. The larger guard turned back to Daniel, lifted a hand, and Amir grabbed his wrist. Silence collapsed over the room like a dropped curtain. The larger guard stared at him in disbelief, then rage. Amir released the wrist slowly, deliberately, and said something quieter this time. Something almost resolute. The tone wasn't defiant. It was firm. A boundary drawn. A refusal. The larger guard muttered a curse and stormed out, the other following reluctantly. Amir waited until the footsteps faded. Then gently he loosened the ropes around Daniel's chest. Daniel's breath shook. "What? What did you tell them?" he managed. Amir met his eyes for a rare moment, not with softness, but with a tired, weary conviction. "No beating," he said simply. It was the first complete sentence Daniel had heard from him. Then Amir stepped away, exhaling, as if the cost of that one act had been enormous. When Amir left the room that day, Daniel sat alone with a spiraling mix of gratitude, confusion, and guilt. Soldiers weren't supposed to feel indebted to their captors. The rules of war drew thick lines between sides. Survival manuals stressed emotional distance. But manuals didn't account for a man who risked punishment just to keep another man unharmed. Daniel's throat burned with thoughts he couldn't articulate. Thoughts that contradicted the simplicity of enemy. "Why are you helping me? What are you risking for this? What do you believe that others here don't?" But the question that clung to him the most was, what kind of man chooses mercy in a place built for suffering? That night Daniel curled against the wall, staring at the faint crack of moonlight under the door. The shadows of guards passed occasionally, but none paused at his cell, and for the first time since capture, he didn't feel alone. He felt tethered to an enemy he didn't understand, to a kindness that made no sense, to a war that suddenly seemed far more complicated than uniforms and flags. Somewhere outside, he imagined Amir sitting by a fire, avoiding conversations. He had no interest in staring into the flames like a man trapped between conscience and command. Two men, two sides, one small bridge forming in the quiet spaces between violence. The war still thundered outside the camp walls, but inside this tiny room, something else was beginning. Not peace, not friendship, something quieter, something rarer. Recognition. The seventh night in the POW camp arrived with a strange stillness, the kind that made Daniel's skin prickle. The usual sounds, the clatter of mess tins, the clipped conversations between guards, the distant rumble of supply trucks were gone, swallowed by a silence far too deliberate. Daniel sat against the wall counting heartbeats. Something was coming. He could feel it. When the door opened for a split second, he expected one of the loud guards, maybe the big one from before, back with a vengeance. Instead, Amir slipped inside like a shadow, closing the door behind him with unusual urgency. Daniel straightened. "Amir, what's wrong?" Amir didn't answer immediately. His eyes swept the corners of the room as if ensuring they were truly alone. Then he knelt beside Daniel, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Soldiers. Angry today," he said. "Commander angry. Patrol lost 3 men. Daniel's stomach twisted. Patrol deaths meant retaliation. In camps like this, retaliation often took a shape that treaties couldn't soften. "Do they blame my side?" Daniel asked cautiously. Amir shook his head. "They blame everyone, anyone." He paused. "Tonight. Stay quiet. No noise. No questions." His tone wasn't harsh. It was protective. Daniel nodded slowly. "Is it because of me? Because of the argument?" "The day you stopped them," Amir exhaled through his nose, looking away. "Them angry, but not for you only." He hesitated. "They think too soft." Daniel swallowed hard. "Are you in danger because of me?" Amir didn't answer, which in itself was an answer. He stood, walked to the door, then paused with his hand on the rusted handle. "You stay alive," he said quietly. Then he left. Hours later, shouting erupted in the courtyard. Not organized military shouting, drunken shouting, chaotic, volatile. Daniel tensed as boots stomped past his door, voices rising in a harsh mix of anger and grief. Someone slammed a metal crate. Someone else cursed at the top of their lungs. The smell of alcohol seeped through the cracks in the room. Then, bang! A fist against the door of the cell 2 rooms down. Then again, and again. A man screamed for mercy. Daniel froze. The scream was cut short by something blunt, striking flesh. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut. He knew what was happening. Rage searches for weak spots and POWs made easy targets. Another door was kicked in. Another scream. The soldiers were moving down the row, toward him. His pulse hammered so hard his fingers went numb. He pressed his back to the wall, instinctively curling inward, breath sharp and uneven. "Stay quiet," Amir had told him. But his own heartbeat was loud enough to shake the air. The footsteps reached his door. A fist slammed against the metal. Daniel held his breath. A furious voice barked something on the other side. The door handle rattled violently, once, twice, 3 times. Daniel's chest constricted. "They're coming in. This is it. This is—" Another voice cut through the tension, firm, sharp, familiar. "Amir." Daniel couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. "Leave this one." The angry soldier shouted back, enraged, refusing. A scuffle erupted. Amir barked something even sharper, almost a command. Silence. Footsteps retreated. Then distant yelling continued down the row, fading into a night thick with violence. Daniel didn't move for a long time. Amir had protected him again. Twice now, publicly. And each time he risked more. But tonight felt different. He hadn't merely intervened, he had stood against his own men in the heat of their grief and fury. Daniel slumped, trembling guilt curling into his gut. "You shouldn't be risking your life for me," he thought bitterly. "I wouldn't want you to." The next morning the camp looked as though a storm had passed, not the kind that breaks trees, but the kind that breaks people. Guards staggered with hangovers. A few huts bore fresh dents. The cell 2 doors down stood open, its wooden frame cracked. Amir entered Daniel's cell quietly. Daniel whispered, "Did anyone die?" Amir shook his head. "Bad hurts, but alive." His shoulders slumped slightly with that last word, alive, as though the bar for hope had sunk terribly low. He placed another bowl of porridge in front of Daniel. Daniel didn't touch it. Instead, he asked softly, "Amir, why are you doing this? Why me?" Amir sat on the floor back to the opposite wall. This was new, he had never lingered before. For a long moment he said nothing. "Then I have brother," he murmured. "Younger, quiet, gentle, like you." He tapped his chest lightly. "Same eyes." Daniel blinked. "One day soldiers come. Take him. Say he helping enemies. Say he traitor." "What happened to him?" Daniel whispered. Amir's jaw tightened. "He never come back." The words fell heavy like stones dropped into a well with no bottom. "I think," Amir continued slowly, "if someone had kindness that day, maybe he's still alive." Daniel's throat tightened. "So you're helping me because I remind you of him?" Amir shook his head gently. "No, I help you because you are you." The simplicity of the statement struck Daniel harder than any beating could have. Amir stood to leave, pausing only long enough to add, "and because war makes too many ghosts." 3 days later, everything changed. A new commander arrived at the camp, a man with a stiff posture and a face carved from stone. Rumors spread fast he was here to restore discipline, to tighten borders, to correct weak protocols. Daniel didn't like the sound of any of it. That evening Amir entered Daniel's cell again, but this time his movements were tight, stiff, uneasy. He looked afraid. "Amir?" Daniel asked, pulse quickening. Amir locked the door behind him, an act Daniel hadn't seen before. "Listen," Amir whispered. "New commander, no like mercy, no like me, no like you." Daniel's mouth went dry. "What does that mean?" "They move all POWs tomorrow," Amir said. "Interrogation. Hard." He hesitated. "Maybe very hard." Daniel's stomach dropped. Tomorrow everything could change. Amir knelt face close to Daniel's, speaking quickly now. "I want help you," he said. "But I cannot help inside camp. Too many eyes, too much danger." Daniel frowned. "Help me how?" Amir took a trembling breath. "I can open door, only little time, maybe 5 minutes. You run far, run until no sound of camp." Daniel stared at him in shock. "Amir, if they catch you?" "Yes," he said simply. "Not maybe. Not they might." "Yes." As if the consequence were as certain as gravity. Daniel shook his head fiercely. "I can't let you do that. You'll be killed." Amir looked at him, eyes deep with a worn sadness Daniel had never noticed before. "You already die if stay," he whispered. "At least with running, chance." He stood straightening his uniform. His decision was made. Daniel felt a cold dread settle into his bones. He didn't want freedom at the cost of Amir's life. But he also knew Amir was right. The new commander wouldn't tolerate Amir's mercy. Tomorrow's interrogation would be something far worse than what Daniel had faced so far. The line had been drawn, not between soldier and prisoner, but between cruelty and conscience. Amir moved toward the door, then hesitated and looked back. "Tonight," he whispered. Daniel's heart lurched. Tonight, when Amir held up 3 fingers, then 2, then 1. "Midnight," he said. He opened the door, stepped out, and paused only long enough to say, "Do not let my brother die again." The door shut softly. And Daniel sat alone, pulse racing, the weight of an impossible choice pressing down on him. He thought of freedom. He thought of Amir's brother. He thought of Amir risking everything for him. And he thought of midnight, the moment the line between life and death would blur. Midnight arrived like a held breath. Daniel had spent the hours leading up to it, counting the seconds between footsteps in the hall, memorizing patterns, listening for any sign that Amir's plan had unraveled. His heart pounded so hard it felt like a second pulse inside his skull. He replayed Amir's words again and again. "Do not let my brother die again." That sentence lodged itself in Daniel's ribs like a splinter, painful, immovable, deeply human. Amir wasn't helping a prisoner. He was trying to rewrite a wound carved into his past. The camp quieted. The guards' conversations faded. Only the wind remained brushing against the cracked windows like invisible fingers. Then softly, 3 taps against the metal door. Not a guard's knock. Amir's signal. Daniel scrambled to his feet. The lock clicked. The door eased open. Amir's silhouette appeared draped in moonlight. "Quick," he whispered. Daniel stepped out, expecting to see guards patrolling the corridor, but it was empty. Vacant in a way that suggested Amir had manipulated the timing down to the heartbeat. They moved like shadows down the dim hall. Daniel's breaths came fast but shallow, each one an effort not to panic. Amir stayed a half step ahead, glancing back periodically to ensure Daniel followed. At the corner, Amir pressed his back to the wall and peeked out. Daniel waited, nerves vibrating. After a moment, Amir motioned. They slipped into the open air. The night was cold, sharp, alive with danger. The moon hung low, a pale coin, behind thin clouds. The camp stretched before them, tents, storage crates, vehicles, all arranged in a deceptively sleepy stillness. Amir guided Daniel behind a supply shed. "Straight line," he whispered. "Past tower to fence. Weak place there." Daniel nodded, adrenaline flooding him. But then he paused. "What about you?" Amir shook his head. "I go different way. If we walk together, they know." "Then come with me," Daniel said urgently. "Run with me. We can both." "No." Amir's voice was firm, quiet, unshakable. "I stay." Daniel stared. "Amir, if they find out you helped me?" "They will," Amir said simply. "But maybe after you far. That enough?" "No, it's not enough." Daniel stepped closer, whispering fiercely. "You deserve to live. You deserve." Amir raised a hand gently. "You live. That is what matter. One life saved. Maybe world change a little." There was no persuading him. His resolve had hardened into something calm and tragic. Amir reached into his pocket and pressed something into Daniel's hand, a folded scrap of paper. Daniel frowned. "What is this, my brother's name?" Amir said. "If you live, speak it somewhere. Say he existed." Daniel's chest tightened. He unfolded the paper enough to see a handwritten name, Yusuf. Daniel swallowed. "I'll remember him. I swear it." Amir nodded once, a gesture of profound trust given without hesitation. Then he pointed toward the far edge of the camp. "Go," he whispered. "Now." Daniel ran. Every footfall felt like a gamble, every breath like borrowed time. Gravel shifted beneath his boots, crunching far too loudly. He crouched behind a parked truck when a guard appeared from the mess tent, muttering to himself, rubbing his neck as if waking from a bad dream. Daniel waited. The guard disappeared. He sprinted again. The tower loomed ahead, dark for the moment, though floodlights sat ready to snap awake. Just beyond it lay the fence Amir mentioned, sagging under the strain of rust and weather. Almost there. Then a shout behind him. A guard had stepped out of a latrine, spotting movement in the dark. Daniel froze. The guard stepped closer, squinting. For a heartbeat, the world balanced on a knife edge. Then the guard called to someone behind him. Daniel bolted. The guard shouted loud, now panicked, and boots thundered across the dirt. Daniel hurtled toward the fence, lungs burning, heart hammering. A spotlight flicked on overhead, slicing a bright white beam across the compound. Stop voices roared behind him. Daniel didn't. He dove for the weak section of fence, metal wires pulled apart just enough for a thin, desperate man to squeeze through. He clawed at it, ripping the opening wider. The metal sliced his hands, hot with blood, but he forced himself through chest-scraping dirt, clothes catching on jagged ends. Behind him, shouts grew louder. The spotlight swung wildly. Boots pounded closer. One last shove, and he tumbled out the other side onto an open field. Free, but not safe. He sprinted into the darkness beyond the fence, legs screaming, breath tearing from his throat. The shouts behind him grew distant, then faded entirely as he crested a hill and disappeared into the thick brush beyond. Only when he reached a ravine miles away did he collapse into the tall grass, chest heaving. He was alive. But at what cost? Back at the camp, the alarm lights flashed red. Guards ran shouting orders. The new commander stormed across the courtyard, demanding answers. Someone reported the break in the fence. Another pointed toward the prisoner corridor. And there, standing alone, was Amir, quiet, still, unarmed. "Where were you when the prisoner escaped?" The commander barked. Amir didn't flinch. "Here," he said. "Why didn't you stop him?" Amir met the commander's stare with the calm of a man who had already accepted the full truth of himself. "Because he was thirsty," Amir said. The commander blinked, but Amir's voice remained steady. "He was thirsty. I gave him water." The commander's face twisted in disbelief. "Are you mocking me?" Amir shook his head softly. "No." But the truth in his eyes said everything. He wasn't mocking anyone. He was telling the most honest answer he had. Because in Amir's world, some souls deserved water more than fear, and Daniel had been one of them. Months later, when peace negotiations ended the conflict, prisoner exchanges began. Daniel returned home thinner scarred, quieter. But inside him, like a small flame kept alive by cupped hands, burned the memory of Amir. And Yusuf. He carried the scrap of paper everywhere he went. Sometimes he unfolded it just to trace the handwriting, wondering who Yusuf had been: a poet, a farmer, a dreamer, an older brother's shadow. One day during a memorial event, Daniel stepped to a podium meant for soldiers to share stories. When his turn came, he didn't talk about battles, or losses, or victories. He talked about a guard, a quiet man, a man who risked everything to hand him water when he expected a beating. A man who believed mercy was stronger than orders, a man who saved him not once, but many times, a man who chose humanity in a place designed to crush it, and at the end Daniel lifted the scrap of paper. "This," he said, "is the name of his brother Yusuf. I speak it today so he will not be forgotten, so that someone in this world remembers that he lived." The room fell silent. Then, applause. Soft at first, then rising. Not for Daniel, but for Amir, for Yusuf, for every quiet act of courage that never makes the news but changes a single life forever. That night, Daniel stepped outside into the cool evening air, looking up at the stars. He whispered two names, Yusuf, Amir, and somewhere deep within him, a truth settled. The world is held together not by armies or nations or flags, but by the moments when one human being chooses to see another human being's thirst and offers water instead of fear.